All right, I'm going to kick things off. Thanks everyone for coming inside on a beautiful evening. Really appreciate you being here. My name is Hannah Phillips. I'm the State Lands Administration Program Manager at the Agency of Natural Resources. This is our second public meeting. We were down in Ludlow at Okemo on Monday, and then we'll be here tonight until about 8 to talk about the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources Lands Management Planning Rule. Before I jump in, want to mention that we are recording this meeting, so just know that this is all being recorded. We will post it to our website after the fact and make that available. The Okemo meeting has been posted already. And I also just want to make sure people know where to find the bathrooms. When you came in through the doors over there, there are 2 red doors, men's and women's, and you can find them right outside if you need them. You will see throughout, it seems like we have enough paper copies of the rule, but there are a few QR codes if you prefer to access them electronically. The Wi-Fi here is the OSSU public, and there's no password that goes with it. So that hopefully will make it possible to access the digital materials if you prefer that. Okay. So to quickly run through tonight's agenda, I'll give an overview presentation, touch on an overview of the Agency of Natural Resources land holdings, an overview of the rulemaking process. We'll actually do a walkthrough of the draft rule, and then we'll talk about how to provide public comment, and then there will be time to provide public comment if you'd like to do that this evening. You don't have to provide comments tonight. There are many ways that you can provide comments, and we'll be accepting them until November 1st. So there's plenty of time, but certainly we want to reserve time for people to make a statement tonight if they'd like. So I'll start by giving an overview of ANR land holdings. Agency of Natural Resources, you'll hear me refer to this as ANR throughout the presentation. Just want to put that acronym out there in the beginning since I think it will roll off my tongue as we go through this. The Agency of Natural Resources is comprised of 3 departments: the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of Environmental Conservation. I'll talk us through the mission statements of these departments as posted on our website. And the distinct land ownerships within each of these departments are managed to advance the mission of each of those departments and the agency as a whole for a wide range of public resource and environmental interests. So to walk through each of those, the Agency of Natural Resources is charged with oversight and management of Vermont's natural environment on behalf of the people of Vermont. The Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, which owns and manages state forests and state parks, has the mission to practice and encourage high-quality stewardship of Vermont's environment by monitoring and maintaining the health, integrity, and diversity of important species, natural communities, and ecological processes, managing forests for sustainable use, including providing and promoting opportunities for compatible outdoor recreation, and providing related information, education, and service. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, which owns and manages wildlife management areas, as well as a few other types of ownerships that I'll walk through in a moment, has the mission of the conservation of fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And the Department of Environmental Conservation, I'll talk about their land ownerships in a moment, has the mission to preserve, enhance, restore, and conserve Vermont's natural resources and protect human health for the benefit of this and future generations. So to provide the broad strokes overview of the fee ownership by the agency, approximately 375,000 acres are owned in fee, which means in their entirety. When you think about all the different rights associated with land ownership, that's what we mean by in fee. So approximately 185,000 acres are owned and managed as state forest by the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. The second largest bundle is approximately 135,000 acres owned and managed as wildlife management areas by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. followed by approximately 54,000 acres of which are owned and managed as state parks by the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. If you're adding that up, it certainly doesn't add up to 375,000 acres. There are other types of land ownership. So just to mention a few of those, the Department of Environmental Conservation owns lands that are associated with dams. That's approximately 2,000 acres across the state. Fish and Wildlife also owns and manages stream bank management areas or riparian lands, which exist along waterways. Fish and Wildlife owns and manages access areas, which provide access to public waters of the state, and also owns and manages 2 conservation camps. So how are ANR lands managed? I think this is helpful to just understand the overarching structure of the work that happens related to management of these lands. So state lands are divided into 5 districts. We have regional offices located in Springfield, Rutland, Essex, Berry, and St. Johnsbury. Each of these districts has what we call a district stewardship team, which is staffed by 10 to 12 natural resource experts, which represent the 3 departments. That includes, this isn't exhaustive, but wildlife biologists, ecologists, foresters, recreation specialists, watershed basin planners, fisheries biologists, and more. The responsibilities of the district stewardship teams are to develop management plans for lands owned and managed by the Agency of Natural Resources, to actually carry out the management of that agency-owned land. They also respond to proposals for use of state lands, and they also evaluate proposed new acquisitions. We also have what is called the ANR Land Stewardship Team, which is staffed by directors and program managers, and their responsibility is to approve plans and policies related to state land management. So as plans are developed by the district stewardship teams, they are passed to the agency land stewardship team for review before they're signed. And this interdisciplinary planning model, drawing from staff in all 3 of those agency departments, forms the backbone of our state land management. And we're proud of this model because of the diverse expertise that it's drawing upon from those 3 departments. So why do we develop management plans? There are many reasons, but I'll highlight 5 of them. The first is that it gives us the opportunity to really step back and think about landscape scale natural resource planning and management. We operate, or the plans operate, with boundaries associated with parcels as those lands transition to state ownership, but the ecological principles governing how those lands live are not bound to those parcel boundaries. And so there are a variety of conservation planning tools that operate at ecological scales rather than at those human scales that we consider in developing these plans. So I'll offer the example of Vermont Conservation Design, or for those of you who are familiar with the Staying Connected initiative, which is really focused on how wildlife moves across the landscape. Management plans give us the opportunity to think about how state lands fit into that larger ecological context, and use those landscape scale conservation planning models. The management planning process also allows us to understand public desires and opinion about management of state lands. It gives us the opportunity to think about balancing those multiple uses, which were stated in our missions earlier. And it gives us the opportunity to provide transparency into state land management through the process itself of developing a management plan. And then lastly, to provide opportunities that the public seeks and that advance the agencies and its department's missions. So that's the high-level overview of ownership and management. I want to talk about the rulemaking process, what it is, how we arrived here, and where we're headed. So what is a rule? The Vermont Administrative Procedures Act establishes that a rule means each agency statement of general applicability that implements, interprets, or prescribes law or policy and that has been adopted in the manner provided by these other sections of Pre-VSA 25. How are administrative rules adopted? This is the process, paraphrased in my own words, drawn from what is called the rule on rulemaking. So there are 4 formal steps in the rulemaking process. The first filing is a pre-filing with what is called the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules, or ICAR. The second filing is a filing of the proposed rule with the Office of the Secretary of State. That second filing actually begins a public notice and public comment period. The third filing is the final proposed rule which is filed with the Office of the Secretary of State and the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, LCAR, which signals the end of the notice and public comment period. And then the fourth filing is the adopted rule, which is filed with the Office of the Secretary of State and the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. Where are we in this process? We have not formally initiated rulemaking, so we haven't even taken that first step of first filing. We've elected to conduct pre-rulemaking public engagement. That's what this is. We wanted to develop a draft rule, put it out there for your feedback. As I mentioned, we're hosting 2 public meetings. This is the second, which will be recorded, and there will be a public comment period that runs until November 1st. And this process will inform how we and when we choose to move forward with the formal process. So a lot of work has gone into getting us to this point, and we wanted to open it up and hear your thoughts before we initiate this formal next step. So just want to be clear about the formal process, and we're still ahead of that. So why are we developing a rule? I'll highlight 3 goals and then elaborate on the third one here. The first is to develop a single comprehensive land management planning process that clearly outlines the process for the public and provides for public input. The second reason is to develop efficiencies in planning and implementation while maintaining the existing thorough review and analysis that's currently contained in the long-range management planning process. And third is really to implement some of the process improvement based on an evaluation that the agency conducted of our planning process between 2020 and 2023. So that's the piece I'm going to elaborate on in this slide. Beginning in 2020, we really started to look at our management planning process. We recognized that currently only about 1/3 of agency lands have a current management plan. Our process currently is very thorough, and thorough means time consuming. As I mentioned, we have 10 to 12 experts on those district stewardship teams, all of whom have a role in developing the management plans. They also all have responsibilities other than developing management plans. And so their time is limited. The process is time intensive and consuming, and it takes us a long time to develop plans. So our goal was to basically identify planning efficiencies without losing that comprehensive natural resource evaluation of the plans, which we think, as I mentioned before, really forms the strong and important foundation for those management decisions for state lands. So how can we find efficiency without losing that comprehensiveness and that value? Was the question that we tasked ourselves with working through. And then lastly, where we see this going is more land, from our perspective, more land with current plans brings more value to Vermonters. So recognizing that all of those multiple benefits that we highlighted in the beginning need that thoughtful planning process and consideration of how one use is considered alongside another in order to make decisions about where we're headed for the next 20 years or so. So greater opportunity to bring those multiple uses, whether that is more recreation opportunities, more lands into the highly sensitive management category. All of that requires that thoughtful deliberation by those complex teams that I mentioned before. So now, with that as context, we're going to jump into the draft rule. There's really no way around this. The rule is a 10-page text document, and we are going to walk through it. I think that's the most helpful overview. But I have paraphrased a fair amount of it in the slide. So my hope is that you were able to grab a copy. You'll walk through this with me. But if you'd rather not dig into that text document, I'll have the highlights up on the screen here. So just to provide an overview, the purpose of the rule is to establish a management planning framework and process, and to set forth the requirements for public input related to land management planning. In my own words, what it does is it establishes this management planning framework. It establishes our public engagement principles and procedures, and it formalizes the land management classifications. And I'll go through each of those. Because we will soon get right into the weeds, I wanted to just start with the high-level overview of major changes from our current practice. This will make more sense at the end, and I will return to this slide at the end. The first is we're proposing an addition of what we're calling a statewide plan, which would apply to all state lands in a single plan. I'll explain more about what that means. The second is that we're proposing the addition of 2 new land management classifications. One that we would call an ecological representation area. The second that we would call an ecological enhancement area. I'll return to these definitions at the end. Both of those, for those of you who have been following or participating in the Act 59 30x30 conservation planning process, one of the tasks of that first phase of the 30x30 effort was to consider how state lands will be used to increase ecological reserve areas. One of the recommendations from that work group was to establish these 2 land management classifications. So this is the process by which we are acting on that recommendation. And then third is to, and this again, I'll highlight at the end, is to add a district designation to the 4 land management classifications. As we're walking through this, as I mentioned, it's dense, it's a lot of information. These are the questions. You're welcome to provide comment on anything that stands out to you, but I think these are 2 areas where you could certainly focus your attention as we go through this, and areas that we know we will really benefit from your input. The first is, does the draft rule provide the public comment opportunities that you desire? And if not, how would you change that? And then the second is, do the land management classifications match the desired conditions you'd like to see on Vermont state lands? And if not, what would you propose changing? So now we'll dive into the draft. We should have plenty of copies for everyone to have a hard copy. So I'm going to jump right into it. Mostly going to zoom through sections 1, 2, and 3, but I'll call out a few key pieces. Section 1 is the purposes. I don't have much to elaborate on there right now. Section 2 is the applicability, which identifies the lands that we propose this rule applies to. So we propose that the rule apply to state forests, state parks, wildlife management areas, the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation lands that are associated with dams, and stream bank management areas, which are owned by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. This rule does not apply to, or we're proposing it does not apply to, easements, mostly because we don't have the authority necessarily to work through the management planning process where we just hold an easement universally across those eased areas. And then second, access areas, conservation camps, and fish culture stations located within other agency land ownerships. And then the last C there is just an important caveat, which is that nothing in this rule shall prevent the agency from taking management actions on ANR lands to address emergency situations that pose a threat to public safety or natural resources. Section 3 is definitions. There are only 2 terms in there right now. The first is, you'll see throughout the rule, use of the phrase ANR lands. That's just referring to the lands to which this rule applies. And B is land management unit. And I did want to elaborate on that because sometimes we will develop a management plan for a single type of ownership, like just a state forest, but other times we'll have a state forest that's located immediately adjacent to a wildlife management area or in close proximity to a wildlife management area. It's essentially a contiguous unit, or when thinking on the ecological scale, it makes sense to plan for those lands as a unit. And so we'll bundle those into what we call a management unit and develop a plan for that management unit. And that decision about how those are bundled is up to the district stewardship team based on the logical bundling of lands when we're thinking at the landscape scale. So you'll see that phrase throughout. Okay, now we get into the land management planning framework. There are 4 types of plans that we speak about in the rule. The first, and then I'll talk about each of these as we go through them. The first is the statewide plan, which remember is something new that we're proposing through this rule. The second is long-range management plans, which we use currently. The third plan type is an interim stewardship plan, which we use currently. The fourth plan type is an annual stewardship plan, which we use currently. And then there's a section that focuses on amendments to those as well. Within each of those first 4 plan types, the rule discusses both content as well as process by which those plans are developed. So I'll start with the statewide plan. As I mentioned, this is a proposed addition to the planning framework. We do not currently have this. It doesn't exist. We're proposing that it would be developed through a public planning process. And the 3 major elements of the statewide plan are as follows. Oh, and I also meant to mention that this is the major addition resulting from that process improvement effort, where we're really seeking that efficiency without compromising on the thoroughness of that geographically specific analysis that happens in the long-range management plans. So the first major component of the proposed statewide plan is the development of what we call universal management actions, which are a list of actions that can be implemented on all ANR lands without an approved long-range management plan. So I define those as routine, ongoing, exigent management activities and maintenance. In other words, these are the basic activities that the public expects of a public land manager, providing public access, addressing public safety concerns, and responding in a timely manner to natural resource concerns. We've provided examples in the rule, but we're proposing that the actual list would be developed through the statewide planning process. And so you can see examples of what that looks like on page, beginning on page 2, and it runs to page 3. So just a few examples to give you a better sense of what we're talking about. Things like the ongoing maintenance of existing infrastructure, such as trails, roads, bridges, culverts, etc. Limited vegetation management activities, such as the removal of hazard trees, maintenance of existing open areas, forest health mitigation activities, etc. Natural resource research, invasive species management, and there's some more examples there. So the goal in including those examples was to give you a sense of the types of activities that we're talking about. But again, that actual list we're proposing would be developed through that public process associated with developing the statewide plan. The second major category or component of the statewide plan that we're proposing is the development of land management classification standards and guidelines, which would establish what can occur or not within each land management classification. And then the third major component is management goals and standards for agency lands. which is an outline of generally applicable management goals for agency lands. So what does that actually mean? Within each natural resource topic area, areas like the forest resource, recreation resources, ecological resources, our intent would be to establish our management goals and standards for the full state lands portfolio. And to describe this a different way, we envision the statewide plan as a step-down plan between any existing topical statewide plan and a long-range management plan. So I'll give you an example. We're in the process of developing our statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. We regularly make updates to the state wildlife action plan. Each of those establish goals and a vision for the whole state of Vermont. What we're proposing the statewide plan would do is essentially interpret those goals for the state of Vermont and apply them to the state lands portfolio before we get to the step of geographically specific recommendations, which are established through the long-range management plan. And the other important piece of that is it gives the opportunity to involve all of you in that conversation about how do we apply this particular plan on the state lands portfolio. So those are the three main components of the statewide plan. Transitioning to long-range management plans, this begins on page 3. Looking first at the content, we're not proposing major changes to the content of long-range management plans as they currently exist. So again, my high-level overview of what they currently include, it opens with a land unit description. It moves into what we call the assessments, or you can think of them as the resource analysis, which is the communication of essentially the current conditions. And you can see those topic areas that we're proposing would be assessed on page 4. So that's the part where we go into the current conditions of the forest resource, the water resources, fisheries, forest health, etc. Then we transition into the management strategies and actions, or you can think of that as a desired future condition. There are 2 important subcomponents of this part. One is the assignment of the land management classifications, which is the actual delineation of certain management classifications on a map that is specific to a particular unit. So that's really where things start to get specific for whatever unit we are planning for. The second piece of that desired future condition is development of an implementation schedule, which is the schedule by which that management will be carried out over the term of the plan. And then lastly, in the appendix, there would continue to be a public responsiveness summary, which is a summary of the comments received, if and how they influenced any changes to the plan, and a description of if and how they influenced any changes to the plan. In terms of process, there are a few changes which we're proposing, which would result from the addition of a statewide plan. So the first major one is that LRMPs would be developed on an as-needed basis when management actions other than universal management actions are proposed. So if something is contemplated on that land unit that exceeds that list of universal management action, that would be the point at which a long-range management plan becomes necessary. LRMPs will generally be developed for a management period of 20 years. And LRMPs are not required for any parcel or land management unit where only universal management actions will occur. Interim stewardship plans, this begins on page 7. This is really a plan type resulting from the land acquisition process. These are developed to provide for certain uses and management activities that occur upon acquisition of land by ANR before a long-range management plan is developed. ISPs are generally focused on uses and management that's consistent with the purpose of the acquisition and the conservation easement, and includes uses and management activities that are necessary to address stewardship concerns, provide basic public access, and protect natural resources. And because these are developed during the confidential land acquisition process, these are not subject to public input. And they're that interim period before a long-range management plan is developed. Annual stewardship plans. Can also think of them as a work plan. An annual stewardship plan identifies projects likely to occur within the next calendar year that have been approved in a long-range management plan. So all activities on the ASP have already been considered through the long-range management planning process, which, remember, is a process that includes public input. We do this annual planning process to ensure that all projects receive a thorough natural and cultural resource review and are consistent with approved management plans before they are implemented. So this is really the fine scale review of every project on state lands by all of the experts that sit on those district stewardship teams. It's the district stewardship team that develops the annual stewardship plan. And these we're proposing would include universal management activities. So those are the 4 plan types. I'll now go to the section on amendments. The draft rule proposes that we may amend an existing long-range management plan or the statewide plan to address the following. First is propose substantial changes in management goals or objectives. The second is propose substantial change in land use or land classification. The third is propose new uses not addressed in the existing LRMP. And the fourth is to add a new parcel of land. So those would be the triggers for an amendment. And amendments are subject to the public engagement process. So you've heard me throughout the presentation refer to the land management classifications, but we're going to dive a little deeper into those because they are such an important part of this planning process. So we're actually going to go back now to page 4. Land management classifications, as I mentioned before, are assigned through the long-range management plan process. They are geographically specific. In this proposal, lands that don't have a long-range management plan will not have land management classifications because we're not going through that full resource inventory that needs to happen to arrive at those 4 classifications. And the 4 classifications, there are 4 parent classes. There are many subclasses. I'm not going to talk about all of the subclasses, but I will give the definition of each of these 4 parent classes. The first is highly sensitive management. This is an area with rare or outstanding biological, ecological, geological, scenic, cultural, or historic significance where protection of those resources is the primary consideration for management. Human activities and uses should not compromise the exceptional features identified. Special management area 2.0 is an area where with special resources where protection and/or enhancement of those resources is an important consideration for management, but a wide range of uses and management activities, including intensive management, are acceptable when protection of the special resource may be achieved. However, timber harvesting, wildlife management, roads, and recreational activities should not compromise the special resource identified. The third parent class is general management. This is in the draft rule defined as an area where the dominant uses are sustainable forest management, wildlife habitat management, concentrated trail networks, dispersed recreation, and other general land uses. In these areas, minimizing conflict between activities is a primary management consideration. Resource areas within or adjacent to a general management area may require special consideration. This category includes all areas of land that do not meet the other classification categories. And then the fourth parent class is intensive management areas, which is an area that is easily accessible and characterized by a high level of human activity and high intensity development on or adjacent to state land. Aesthetics and safety are the primary management considerations in these areas. However, more sensitive resources that occur within these areas may require special consideration. So a good example there is any of the state park fee areas. And then all of these 4 parent classes have subclasses associated with them. So I definitely encourage you to dig into this section, look at those definitions of each of those parent classes, look at those subclasses. That's certainly one of the areas where it feels a little more tangible to weigh in on, and we appreciate your input on, does this offer this suite of opportunities on state land that needs to exist as we go through this planning process. So section 5, we're now transitioning out of the management planning framework and into the public involvement piece of this. And this was the other big question that I posed to you in the beginning is, does this proposed rule provide for those public input opportunities that you seek? And if not, how would you change it? So section 5.1 talks about public scoping, which is conducted prior to drafting, or we're proposing would be conducted prior to drafting a statewide plan or long-range management plan to assess public opinion regarding uses and management of agency lands. The rule establishes the timing for all of that and proposes a minimum 2-week notification and minimum 30 days to comment. Of course, you can always do more than that. And it also establishes the proposed notification methods, which currently says shall occur via press release and posting on the agency's website, with other forms of public notice as determined appropriate. Section 5.2 talks about public comment and a public informational meeting. So it says the public shall have the opportunity to comment on a draft statewide plan, draft long-range management plan, or a proposed amendment to either of those. It says at least one public informational meeting regarding a draft statewide plan, draft LRMP, or a proposed amendment shall be conducted. The proposed minimum comment period is the same, so 2 weeks in advance of a public informational meeting, and the public comment period, which will last at least 30 days, could always go more than that. And at a minimum, notification shall take the form of press releases and posting on the agency's website. It also establishes that a responsiveness summary shall be included in the final draft statewide plan, LRMP, or amendments, which will address those comments received. And that all public comments received during official scoping and public comment period shall be maintained in accordance with the ANR records retention procedures, which are approved by the Secretary of State. So that's the rapid run through. I want to sort of tie it up again with some of those introductory slides I offered. Again, the major changes from the current practice, not speaking really to the minor changes, are first the proposed addition of a statewide plan. And the second is the proposed addition of 2 new land management classifications. Do you want to elaborate on these now? The first one, ecological representation area, would be a subclass of the highly sensitive management area, which would include associations of natural communities, geophysical settings, or other areas which make an outstanding contribution to meeting the ecological representation goals identified in Vermont conservation design. The second proposed addition is a subclass of the special management category, which we would call an ecological enhancement area, which are areas that are designated by ANR in which active management in the near term may create or restore conditions that will qualify these lands as a highly sensitive management area in the long term. And then we're also proposing adding a district designation to all 4 of those parent classes. Currently, that just exists in the highly sensitive management area. But just to give you a sense of how that's phrased, if I'm looking at the subclass of the highly sensitive management area 1.11, a district designation would be areas not otherwise described above. In other words, it's not already stated as a subclass, but possessing other characteristics consistent with the description of a highly sensitive management area. And we're proposing that for the other 3 types of land management classification as well. So I'm going to wrap up by talking about how to submit a public comment on this draft rule. So we're now stepping outside of the rule. We're not talking about the proposed management planning process anymore. I'm talking about this rulemaking procedure. The comment period opened on August 27th when we first posted this and notified others that it was posted, and it will run through November 1st. So different ways that you can submit comments. You can attend one of the public meetings and provide a comment tonight. You can attend one of the public meetings and submit a comment in writing. We have comment slips over at the registration table. If you want to take this and process it, think on it, and get back to us later, you can submit your comment through our online comment form, which is the actual URL to do that should be on the front page of your handout, linked to that website. Or if you're comfortable using a QR code, that should take you to it as well. You can send an email to ANR State Lands Planning at vermont.gov. We will monitor that for this as well, or you can mail your comments to me at our office in Montpelier. So in just a moment, we are going to transition to the public comment portion tonight. I want to just pause and welcome any clarifying questions that you have, really about the contents of what we're proposing in the draft rule. So welcoming clarifying questions to really help you understand the contents of the rule or the rulemaking process. I just ask that if you have a comment, we'll have plenty of time for the comments after this. And so I'll really just focus on those questions that are clarifying in nature. And if I'm not able to answer it, we'll just have to move on, but I'll do my very best. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I really appreciate you sitting through that. And yeah, let me know if anything comes to mind. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah. I certainly can't tell you off the cuff. I believe that's worked into the Act 59 inventory calculation of the, is that correct? Yeah. I'll get back to you. I think that this was recently calculated for the 30 by 30 inventory. Yep. Sorry, his question was, does the agency have a statewide, tell me if I get this wrong, a statewide calculation of the 4 types of land management classifications currently? And I think your question was also, is there somewhere where you can access it? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I don't know how much. Yeah. Welcome. Yes. What is design? Talk about that. Highly sensitive and that. Sure. I might put our director of wildlife on the spot, but Vermont Conservation Design, I'll describe it as a conservation planning tool for the state of Vermont. I don't think that I connected it directly to our highly sensitive management areas. At that point, I was talking about, or when I brought that up, it was the slide to talk about why we develop management plans and how we use these landscape scale conservation planning tools. So that's one tool that we incorporate into our long range management plans.
Trying to access a wide range of ecological data and information that gives us a map and functional landscape of the state. These things like the lots and a wide range of activities, even like find local information like that. All of this data is compiled by those most important areas of the state, which is roughly 68% of the state.
Yes, I just wonder if there's part of your agency that deals with global climate change specifically and how it impacts the Vermont landscape in terms of species moving from south to north, trees being stressed, natural and ecological habitats experiencing stress due to what we just experienced on July 10th, et cetera, et cetera? Is there any kind of specific department that specifically deals?
There is a part of our agency that deals with that. We have the Climate Action Office. It's not my area, so I don't really feel comfortable speaking about their priorities, but in terms of the ecological implications of climate change, I think the overview that John just gave of Vermont Conservation Design is one great example of how our consideration of climate change is integrated throughout all of the different resource areas that we consider on state lands. So whether it's wildlife migration, as you mentioned, water resources, fisheries. Can't work in natural resources and not have to look face to face at the impacts of climate change. And so it's embedded in every element of what we do. But yes, to your first question, there is a specific climate section of the Agency of Natural Resources. Yes.
Yeah, there's the mic.
Yeah. This is a question.
It's a
Well, did you send it?
I did say.
Okay, we'll get to comments.
Oh, I understand. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm happy to answer other questions as they come up afterwards, but it seems like we're just about ready to transition to comments. So let me give the quick run through of how we're going to do this. So if you haven't already signed up, but you would like to provide a comment tonight, you can head right over to Gunnar at the registration table. He's managing the list of commenters. How many people do we have signed up currently? Okay, so we'll do the 2 minutes, which we did at Okemo on Monday. So we originally said 90 seconds, but we bumped that on Monday. We'll bump that tonight to 2 minutes. For your comment, our goal is really to hear from you. It's not intended as a back and forth, so we're hoping that you'll come up and share your piece and we can listen. As I mentioned, I just want to mention it again. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website, so just know that if you're up here, you are being recorded. We will post all comments received on our website after the comment period closes. And yes, you can still submit written comments too. This isn't your only opportunity. So please do provide a comment tonight if you'd like. And then you also have till November 1st to provide written comments. And then if our comments don't take us to 8 p.m., we'll wrap up early, but we will stick around. So if other questions come up, you'll be able to find us. Yes, Zach.
Question. Wondering, earlier in the meeting, let's see, you mentioned, I think that, or in the presentation, that 1/3 of ANR lands have a current management plan. I was curious if you could just elaborate on that. Does that mean that 1/3 of ANR lands have ever had a management plan, or what I was thinking about is, as I was watching the presentation and it mentioned, I think that management plans can last essentially indefinitely. So I don't know what makes the management plan current or not current. So how do you define current?
I would define current as still within the implementation schedule. So we haven't completed the actions that are listed within the current plan, but that's my off the cuff response. Yeah.
I'm the question of how many, does it mean that 1/3 of parcels have a plan, or that are there more parcels that have plans that are just, I guess, maybe they've run through all the actions? You know how many rows there might be?
I don't, and I think we're getting into the semantics of how you define those. And so I'm happy to sort of chat about this afterwards and the different, what are the different categories that you could bundle them into? Yeah, but I wouldn't be able to provide that. Yes, one more question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
We're not real. May I ask you to take any time to gas pipeline?
I don't feel prepared to jump into that. It's not my area of expertise. So I'm going to move us towards the comment portion, but thank you. So again, of course, your comments are welcome on any aspect of this that you'd like to comment on, but again, the questions that I think would may help a little bit in terms of how do you want to dig into this is, does the draft rule provide the public comment opportunities that you desire? And second, do the land management classifications match the desired conditions that you'd like to see on Vermont state lands? And if not, what would you propose changing? That's really the most helpful outcome that we're seeking out of tonight. So I'll just wrap up with our expectations for the public comment. Assume good intentions. We're all here because we care deeply about this subject matter and Vermont state lands. As I mentioned, the most helpful piece of this for us is if you can offer constructive feedback or tangible recommendations for how we can change the rule. That is extremely helpful to us. We're very appreciative when there's a constructive recommendation. To please be respectful as you're delivering your comments, and then to honor the requested time limits. So at this point, if you did sign up to provide public comment, Gunnar has been randomizing those, so you might not go in exactly the order that you signed up. And I'm going to take a seat, and Becca's going to walk us through these. I just have to pull up the list.
Give your little break for a few minutes, right, Evan? Thanks, everybody, for sitting through the presentation. I know it's really dense. It's amazing, complex, and wonderful work, and appreciate that you spend the time sort of taking that journey with us. As Hannah said, we're going to go through public comment, 2 minutes each. If there are ideas or questions that come up afterwards as we're cleaning up and tidying up, those won't be part of the formal public comment process. So if something occurs to you through those conversations, please do make sure that you plan to submit those as a public comment on the online form or with one of the cards.
And I forgot to mention Niels will be. Thanks. Thanks. I also forgot to mention that Niels sitting in the front row here has a little sign that shows when you have 30 seconds remaining and when your time is up. So if he's flashing you the folder, that's what that means.
Thanks again, Hannah. I really appreciate you walking us through that. The person with the great benefit of being first is Alan Pierce.
Good evening. This year marks the 100th anniversary of Vermont State Parks, but I have no reason to celebrate because ANR continues to commercially log our parks, contrary to the best climate science and in absence of any rules. The purpose of rulemaking is to give the public opportunities for input into public land management. The proposed rules severely restricts already limited opportunities for public input, thus running contrary to the spirit and purpose of rulemaking, namely increased transparency. Rulemaking is an annual process in many states. The state of Washington has published more than 5 forestry rules regarding the spotted owl alone. By contrast, Vermont has no rules about the endangered long-eared bat. And it is unclear from this presentation whether ANR will propose any more rules in the future. In short, ANR requires more public and legislative oversight. Why? I'll give just a few examples. 1, because the agency routinely trades in misinformation with the public and the legislature. 2, because the agency was deemed incompetent in its implementation of the Clean Water Act, despite being led by a water expert. 3, the agency has refused to set aside hydrological reserve zones in the Worcester Management Plan, despite the recommendations of the Underwood-Brin report, and despite the Wrightsville Dam coming within 8 foot of overflowing last year. And 4, because the agency refuses to set aside forest for old growth restoration, contrary to Vermont climate legislation. Thank you.
Next in line is Rod Coronado.
How you doing? Hi, my name is Rod Brown, from the town of Orange. I work for Sage Mountain Botanical Sanctuary. We're a 600-acre reserve that borders the Groton State Forest. We also have after-school programming and summer camps for middle school kids. I want to speak to some of the land management classifications, but first I just want to answer the question, do the LMCs meet the goals of what I'd like to see for Vermont lands? And yes, they do. They're a great beginning. And I most am tentative to let's see, subsection 2.2 that recognizes the need for wildlife corridors. I'm hoping that, ANR recognizes that upgrades need to recognize the needs of both aquatic and terrestrial species. Corridors can be big and small. I visited the Little River Wildlife Shelf. It only costs $10,000 to add soil over the boulders so that moose and other animals could cross. As you might know, 1 million vertebrates are killed on US roads every day. In Vermont, we had about over 40 moose have been killed by vehicles. So corridors save lives and money. I want to offer my support for removing obsolete dams on ANR lands, like in the Sexton River in Westminster for the recovering sea lampreys. Those are lampreys that aren't being controlled in Champlain River. 400,000-year-old species. I really like the forward-thinking goals for restoration of our rivers and forests, thinking about crossings for not just moose and bears, but also for wolves, cougars, lynx, and extirpated species. And other than that, thanks for your work. Thanks. No, I'm good.
The next person in line, and forgive me if I don't pronounce this correctly, Dunja Holler.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll move to the next person. Edward Christopher Weatherby.
Hello. Regarding question 2 that you had up there, I think that in your highly sensitive management subclasses, there should be a subclass to conserve mature and old growth forests. That could easily be a class by itself, along with all that other stuff. Thank you.
Next public commenter would be Jameson Irvin. He makes a good handle, doesn't he?
Thank you, Jamie Irvin. Today marks the 900th day since we formally petitioned ANR to begin rulemaking process. It's also the 790th day since ANR formally rejected that petition. So I congratulate you on your alacrity and change of heart, especially since it was required and is required by law. 7 key issues. 1, stop ignoring Vermont's laws. HS 606 requires 30% conservation by 2030. And Act 59 calls for 9% of Vermont's forests as old forest. Stop the legal runaround and start following our laws in letter and spirit. 2, stop ignoring the risk of flooding. Your own 2015 report states that logging of state lands increases flooding risk at a cost of more than $6 billion to Vermonters by 2050. Stop prioritizing logging over Vermonters' safety and well-being. 3, stop accelerating extinction. Listen to the biologists about the long-eared northern bat and a species that is, or at least was present in Camel's Hump before you logged it. 4, stop ignoring climate science. No, younger forests do not sequester more carbon than older forests. No, logging does not have a low carbon input. Soils are the biggest input. And no, biofuels are not climate friendly. They are worse than fossil fuels. Listen to the science and stop the climate gaslighting. 5, stop the special interest false narratives. Stop pretending that logging state forests is cost effective when you're sending hundreds of truckloads to Quebec on pennies for the dollar. Stop pretending that forests require logging to thrive. They do not. Stop the spin. 6, stop public input, performative theater. Your own commissioner has said, quote, even if public comments are overwhelmingly against logging, that doesn't mean harvest will be scaled back. It's no coincidence that rulemaking started after the comments, after restoration, after Kindlesum have been decided. And finally, enter the 21st century, stop operating like it's 1924, because, thank you very much, the future of Vermonters and our biodiversity depend on it.
Thank you. The next speaker is Chris Gish.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Gish. I live in Cambridge, farm worker, and I treasure our state lands. I have kind of two areas of feedback and concerns, which somewhat line up with the two questions that the ANR posed to us. The first is around public comment. And as I was going through the draft rule, I was struck that it seems like a very minimal process for public comment. Having a minimum of a 30-day comment window and only letting the public know by the press release and posting on the ANR website does not strike me as extensive. I think the comment period should be at minimum 60 days, and the ANR should be sure to post in our state and regional newspapers of records to anyone who's subscribed to any email updates and do their best to get the word out in other ways. I also think, more importantly, the public should have input to review and suggest improvements to the statewide plan and long-range management plans after they are initially approved, because as it stands now, this 20-year plan could go into effect and the public is out of the loop for that entire period unless the ANR decides to initiate an amendment on their own terms. And then some thoughts on the content of the plan. The draft plan didn't have a lot of information to give the public a sense of how the ANR would prioritize the various uses it claims to balance. And it doesn't ground itself in the changing biophysical reality of Vermont. It would be very helpful to include a brief summary of the reality of climate change, what we can expect, our current level of impacts on our forests, and review all actions, especially timber sales and road building, in comparison to real and enduring public goods like flood mitigation, climate adaptation, carbon storage, biodiversity protection, and clean water. Thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bob Galvin.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Hello, everybody. Oh, sorry. My name is Bob Galvin. I live in Richmond. And yeah, just wanted to share some of my thoughts on changes to this plan. First and foremost, I feel like the recommendations from the legislature that spawned this rulemaking should be more easily findable on ANR's website. In this rules webpage on ANR's website, there was no easy way to find the legislation that spawned this. Could easily be adjusted by having the act language in the documents for review section. Moving on, I think that wildlife habitat should have a higher classification priority. In particular, I think Section 2, subclass 2.2, involving critical plant and wildlife habitat should be moved up into the first section. I think that especially when contrasted with intensive management, our wildlife can't afford to have the prospect of intensive management be facing them. So I think we can move that classification up into a more protected class and better protect wildlife that way. I think that the public comment process leaves a lot to be desired. I think that there are more opportunities to engage the public. I think that press release and posting on the website is insufficient to engage the number of Vermonters who care about these issues. I think that specifically 5.2b, there should be at least 2 meetings, if not more, 1 in person and 1 remote. Thank you very much for the time.
Nolan Carver's next.
Thank you, Becca. My name is Nolan Carver. I'm a resident of Montpelier, the capital city. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm a psychiatric survivor and mentally ill. Also in recovery. I've been getting involved in my community and learning a lot about the world for the first time in my life. It's quite an interesting time to be in recovery. There's so much controversy these days at times, everywhere from the State House to around the world. Can we talk about some people dying in Africa due to climate change? Can we have a serious conversation tonight that's honest? Can I look at a member of the state in the eyeballs and can I ask you, is it wise to have natural gas pipe through the state of Vermont at this time? But these and other questions are being answered slowly and surely. I thank you folks for coming up to this microphone and saying something. I drove from Montpelier tonight just to get a beautiful view of our state, and I'm here with a moral prerogative. I'd like to quote from 350 Vermont, values that guide our work, justice. We believe that to address the climate crisis adequately, we must address its root causes. One of those root causes is power being concentrated in the hands of a few at the expense of our people and planet, which has led to many intersecting injustices. We must respect and act in solidarity with those who have been historically excluded from that power, both locally and globally, and work for solutions that hold the powerful accountable and that address energy consumption and impacts globally. The climate crisis impacts all of us, but it disproportionately impacts those who have been excluded from decision-making tables.
That's 2 minutes.
Particularly BIPOC, frontline and poor communities.
That's 2 minutes.
We must work to address how privilege and oppression show up in our organization as well as in the wider world. We believe that learning from and working with partners from the communities most impacted by the climate crisis
You've exceeded your
and making the connections between the climate crisis and interconnected injustices explicit is essential for transforming what is politically possible. Thank you. Have a nice night.
Apologize to others that obeyed the time limit. I wish that you had to. Thank you for your comments. Zach Porter, dissent.
Sorry you feel that way, Becca.
Sorry, but
I'm sorry you feel that way, Becca.
come on up, Zach.
It's a free country.
Hey, everybody, good evening. I'm Zach Porter, I'm a resident of Montpelier. I'm the executive director of Standing Trees, which is a community of public land, wildland advocates, and really appreciate the chance that ANR has given tonight for the public to weigh in. I know that there are very brilliant, bright, reasonable people working at ANR. I'm looking at many of you right here, many of you might consider to be friends. What I think I want to take this brief time to say tonight is that as I read through the draft rule, and thank you for the time that you put into it, the sense that I got was not that ANR desired public, wanted to understand public desires and opinion, as was stated earlier, or provide transparency. And this, apparently is the stated intent of this rulemaking process, but at every turn in this draft rule, there are ways that the state has allowed itself to keep the public at arm's length. And this is the chance, really, perhaps once in a lifetime chance, to make sure that the public does have a real seat at the table in public admin. And it was mentioned earlier tonight that ANR owns these lands. ANR doesn't own any land. The people in this room own the land. And ANR happens to take care of it. And the way this rule was written does not reflect the fact that it's the public that owns it. And so as I'm going to go through this and with many others who have comments in the near future, I look forward to more conversations with you all about this. I really want to make sure that the rule recognizes the fact that it's us, the people of Vermont, who own this land and deserve much more opportunity for engagement, reflection, weighing in on agency actions than what's offered by this right. So thank you again for the chance to come out today.
That concludes the list of folks that signed up to give public comment. I thank you again for taking the time to be here with us this evening and encourage you all to submit written comments through the various forms that Hannah mentioned earlier. And again, thank you so much. Take care.